And it says we are now live. So now I'm going to reshare my screen and share the little PowerPoint slide deck I had for this. All right, and we're ready to go. So I'm just going to get this show on the road here for our huge audience out in YouTube land. Today's topic is Intro to Gamification. I don't know where people's interest levels or knowledge levels are when it comes to gamification here. Camille, I don't know if you want to share why you're here today.
Well, I'm sort of interested if there's a way that I can track some things outside of grading that might motivate students. So things like I ask them to come and Zoom with me once a week, but they don't necessarily do that. So it'd be sort of nice to track.
Okay. We can talk a little bit about some of that. The challenge of this topic in a 15-minute session is that if you start to really get into the details of it, that would take an hour or two. So for this particular session, at least, we're kind of gonna look at the overall framework of gamification and what it is and how it fits within other kinds of teaching styles. And then depending on the response and the interest in this, we might do a part 2 where we really get into some of the nitty-gritty details. But I'm also more than happy to sit down and do a one-on-one chat about some specific tools later on if you're interested.
Okay.
So let's get into this. So gamification, I was looking for a few good definitions of this, and I kind of ended up making my own by stealing half of a dictionary definition and half of a Wikipedia definition. But basically, gamification is the process of adding game design elements and game principles into non-game contexts, which includes your classroom, but it can also include lots of things. Lots of different systems can be gamified in order to improve motivation, engagement, and learning. So out of that definition, then I had the question, what do game design elements look like? What does that mean? Oops. So what are some game elements or game design elements that we often see in gamification? What is a game? Whether it's a video game or a board game or a sport, what is a game? And some of the common elements of a game are there's some kind of structure or some kind of rule set. There's a common set of rules that everybody is following in order to play this game. There's a sense of playfulness or fun. If it's not fun, then it's not really a game. It might be something else. It might be a simulation. It might be a chore, but it's not a game unless there's some, at least, attempt at having fun. There's usually a goal or a sense of achievement. There's something you're working towards, either individually or as a team or as a whole big cooperative group, but there's something you're trying to accomplish. There's usually some form of interaction or collaboration. So again, you might be working on a team, or it might be a competitive game, a competitive sport, where you are interacting with people on the other side of the board or the game field or whatever. There may be some sense of competition or conflict, although that's not always necessary. And in fact, in some cases, especially in a teaching environment, we probably don't want to encourage a lot of competition and conflict. But sometimes a little bit of friendly competition can be a useful or fun element in your course design. There is often a sense of exploration or curiosity that in getting the game player to want to explore the rule set of the game that they're playing, want to explore what the limits are, what the tricks are, what are some shortcuts or some secrets as part of that game. If you can inspire a sense of curiosity or exploration, then obviously the game player is going to be more engaged, more motivated, more into it. And then again, not all games have this, but many games have a narrative or a sense of role playing, where there's a storyline that you're going through as you play this game, or that you are taking on a role other than yourself. You're playing as a robot or a soldier or a princess or an Italian plumber who's fighting a giant turtle. So again, this is not something that every game has or every sport has, but many of them do have an element of narrative or role playing to them. So in doing some research and some reading on this topic, some people that do a lot of game theory and game design, it actually became clear that gamification is really just one subset of a bigger category, the category of ludic pedagogy. Ludic is a Latin word for game playing, basically. So gamification is one aspect of that, but there are others. So I just wanted to kind of briefly go through these, because again, we only have 15 minutes, so we're not going to write a dissertation here, but I want to give a taste of some of these ideas. So when it comes to gamification, probably the most common form that we see are these three: badges, points, leaderboards. Canvas and most learning management systems have a badge system integrated into them in some way, where the instructor creates a badge, which is, it's like a merit badge for a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, right? It's a little design, it's a little sticker or a little patch or something. And then based on things that your students do, whether it's earning a certain score on an assignment or participating in something or doing something, achieving something, you give them a badge. And it's not that much different from giving them a grade, but it's also a little visual representation. It can be used as proof that they know how to do something or that they have accomplished something. And a lot of people like badges. Not everybody does. Some people think it's a little gimmicky, but some people are really motivated by them. They feel a little rush of endorphins when you get a badge. Same with points. Again, points are not really that different from a grade, but it's a different framework for thinking about your achievement. And usually points are integrated with some kind of leaderboard. If you wanted to use a leaderboard, then you show, well, student A has 150 points, and student B has 125 points, and student C only has 50 points. So that can, again, leaderboards are kind of an iffy thing, because for some students, they're very motivating, especially if they're doing really well and they're sitting near the top of that leaderboard. They might be motivated to stay that way, to work harder, to get up one more level on the ladder. If they're not doing so well, a leaderboard might be demotivating. And they see that and they say, wow, I'm in the bottom 25% of the class. That's not so great. Maybe I should just give up. So leaderboards are kind of a double-edged sword, and not even necessarily a tool that always makes sense. But I have seen them used effectively, usually by doing it anonymously, where each student has a little avatar or a secret nickname, or even just a number code or something, so that they know where they fall in the leaderboard, but they don't necessarily know where other students are. And part of that's also kind of a privacy issue. But I have seen some instructors use points and leaderboards and use them in classes that make sense with student populations that enjoy it. But it's not necessarily a tool that makes sense for everyone. But those are just a couple of gamification elements. There are others. A big one is scaffolding or leveling. And you may have heard of scaffolding outside of gamification, because it's really just a good teaching theory, a good course design element, is the idea of building one thing on top of the other, starting with a intro paragraph for a paper, and then getting some feedback on that, and then making a draft based on that first assignment that they did, getting some more feedback, then making the final version. That's a very basic 3-layer scaffold right there. But in a lot of games, we would call that leveling, where you're starting at an easy beginner level, testing out some skills or learning something, trying to apply it. And then if you have it mastered that level or gained the correct amount of achievement or understanding, then you move on to the next level. It's a little bit more difficult, a little more challenging. Maybe makes you either learn some new skills or apply your existing skills in a new way. And again, many people do this without even thinking about it in a game's perspective. It's just part of good teaching often. Another element of gamification is player choice, giving people some options to choose from. And again, this is something we often see in UDL, in Universal Design for Learning, where we are giving people multiple formats of some content. Maybe you're giving them a textbook chapter and a video and a podcast. Or maybe you are giving them some choice in an assignment where you would let them write a paper, but you might also let them make a presentation or record a video or do something else. Again, this is not necessarily something that you just do in a gamified class, but it's part of gamification, this idea of giving your players or your students choice. Low risk failure is also often a big part of this. Giving your students the chance to try something without a big pressure of failure. If a class only has a handful of very high stakes assessments, 2 term papers or 3 tests, and that's their entire source of their grade, then that's very high risk. When there's high risk, then your students are less likely to take chances, to be curious, or to experiment with different things. They're more likely to be very narrowly focused on avoiding that high risk failure. But if we give them chances for low risk failure, whether that is some self-checking assessments, whether that is drafts and peer reviews, whether that is low stakes quizzes or low stakes discussions, it gives us a chance to explore the content, try to practice our skills without that high risk of failure. Again, narrative and role playing. I have seen some instructors kind of build their course as if it's a story. And again, this is not always just gamification. Many classes are sort of accidentally built that way, where you are telling a story. You're starting with an introduction to a subject, and then you're talking about the history of that subject, or you are introducing new wrinkles into that concept along the way. And you're building towards some sort of climax. Maybe that climax is just in that one course. Maybe the course is just a chapter in the entire program where you're building towards, a capstone class or a final assessment, or ultimately getting them out to the job field. But oftentimes we do these things in the form of a narrative. But part of gamification is being a little more intentional about that narrative. And then again, a big thing is immediate feedback. If you're playing a game, if Dr. Mario here, because Ben changed his name, I don't know if you can see that in YouTube. If Mario jumps too soon and falls in a pit and dies, well, that's instant feedback. You immediately know, okay, I didn't do that right. And then you go back to the start of that level, and you try it again. And you keep trying based on that feedback until you've mastered the skill and moved on to the next level. Immediate feedback can be in the form of a self-check, where a student is doing a short little ungraded or low stakes quiz just to make sure that they understand the content. It could be in the form of a peer review, classmate feedback, or just feedback from the instructor on proposals and intro paragraphs and drafts and that sort of thing. Oftentimes, immediate feedback is connected with low risk failure and with scaffolding. So those are just a few concepts of gamification. But again, there's 2 other categories in our box here. Game-based learning is similar to gamification, but it's not the same thing. It's using smaller discrete games to learn or to practice something. So that might be a math game where when I was a kid in school, we played a video game called Math Blaster on the old black and white Mac computers, which was super fun because you had a little character and you were doing solving math problems along the way. And every time you solved a math problem, your character ran a little bit faster or dodged a bullet or something like that. Simulations are a form of game-based learning. This is very common in things like nursing programs or automotive programs, where they have a simulation of an engine diagnostic, or a simulation of a blood test, or even like a really complex, fancy patient simulation where you have like a little robot sitting there next to you that has vital signs. You can check its pulse, you can check its blood pressure, you can even stick a needle into its plastic arm to practice taking blood. Icebreakers at the start of a quarter is a form of game-based learning, where you're just playing a little discrete, fun little game in order to break the ice, in order to get your students to engage with each other, to introduce themselves. Role-playing games might make sense when you are teaching a concept where eventually students need to get out in the field and interact with somebody. So you might have one student taking on the role of a client and one student taking on the role of a therapist. And they are role-playing those characters. They're interacting as if they were really that person, and then practicing their skills, practicing that experience, and then talking about it. And then the last category here, playful interaction. This is a little more nebulous, but it kind of gets at the idea of not taking yourself too seriously, not taking your course too seriously. And I don't mean that in like it's not rigorous, but I mean that in that you have opportunities for fun, opportunities for exploration or experimentation. You have activities or discussions or assignments where you are encouraging your students to collaborate with each other on something. You're encouraging them to take a risk of some sort. Again, some of this goes back to those gamification ideas of low risk failure and immediate feedback. You're helping your students feel safe enough that they can step outside their comfort level and try something new without the fear of failure, basically. Some examples of playful design that I have seen instructors do. There was a business instructor that I used to work with and help out. And in his class, at the start of each quarter, he gave every student 2 paper Monopoly $1 million bills. And he said, these are your $2 million. Keep a hold of these, put them in your folder or whatever, take them to class with you every day. And then during the quarter, every day he would call on a couple of students to help lead the discussion for that day, which meant that those students needed to be prepared. They needed to have read the content. They needed to have participated in the online discussion. They needed to come to class ready to help lead that discussion. And you didn't know when you were going to be picked. It was, he picked your name out of a hat. But if you were called on that day to lead the discussion, and for whatever reason you were not prepared, you could turn in one of your $1 million bills and say, I'm going to pay $1 million to not have to lead the discussion this week. No questions asked. Everybody got 2 freebies. And he could have just said that you have 2 freebies every quarter. He could have just had a clipboard with names written down. But by doing those 2 things of giving them a physical fake dollar bill and physically pulling random names out of a hat, that added a sense of fun, a sense of risk to the course, a sense of randomness. And he always said it was teacher random, meaning it wasn't always completely random. Sometimes he knew what names he was picking out of the hat because it was a student he hadn't called on for a while. Sometimes he knew that these 2 students didn't get along very well, so they didn't always get picked at the same time. But by giving that sense of playfulness, it helps students feel a little safer in the class, help them be more engaged, help them, again, be more willing to take risks and to put themselves out there because they had that little extra safety net. So those are just a few ideas and categories in this big idea of ludic pedagogy. There's many more, and I could talk about each individual one of these for another hour if I wanted to, but that's just a really big, broad overview of these ideas. So when we talk about things like gamification, often the question comes up, is it worth it? I mean, this sounds like a lot of work. Is this actually going to benefit my students in some tangible way? And there's some research on this topic. And what is interesting is The research is a little, I'm not going to say it's not conclusive, but it's mixed. So there have been many studies about the effects of gamification in higher education, in K-12 education, in non-classroom settings. Most studies have shown that there is a positive effect from gamification on student motivation, that on average, students are more motivated when they experience some of these game design elements. And many students report greater course satisfaction. But the effects of this are in the big average aggregate, the effects are pretty modest. And that's especially true for those really simple gamification elements. If we're just talking about badges, points, and leaderboards, those don't have a huge positive effect. Most studies that just study that kind of gamification usually shows something, but it's usually pretty weak. The forms of gamification that are more effective are those deeper game design ideas of narrative, of scaffolding, of student choice, of collaboration, of immediate or at least quick feedback. Those things we know from research are effective at improving student motivation, satisfaction, and completion. Another thing that a lot of studies have noted is that not all students enjoy gamification. And again, this often comes back to those big three, the badges, points, and leaderboards. Some students just don't care about badges, and some students are actively demotivated by leaderboards. So when we are talking about gamification elements, we want to be really intentional about what we're doing and how those things are affecting our students. And oftentimes, maybe not always, but often we should think about if we can make some of these things optional. Because you are still going to have some students that, they really just want to read the textbook, take the quiz, turn in the paper, and be done. They may not want to do a role-playing game. They may not want to participate in a leaderboard. They may not want to collect badges. So we want to think about if we want to make some of these things optional or required. That's something you really need to be conscious of as you're starting to think about integrating some of these ideas. That being said, most instructors that do gamification personally get a lot of fulfillment and enjoyment from it. I think sometimes it's almost as important that the instructor is having fun as that the student is having fun. Because when the instructor is engaged and excited and motivated, that's always going to lead to better outcomes for the students as well. They see your enthusiasm, they pick up on that, and they will usually return that in kind. So I would say to anybody who's kind of on the fence about some of these gamification ideas, if it excites you, if you are interested and motivated by it, then it's probably worth exploring. As long as we are conscious about how it affects our students, how we're designing these things in a way that is either motivating or not motivating. We want to be aware of student choices and preferences. But all that being said, if you want to do some gamification, come talk to me because I want to talk to you about it. I would love to help somebody gamify a course either in big ways or in small ways. I have helped instructors build role-playing games into their courses before. I've helped instructors build escape rooms, which is a ton of fun. I've helped instructors design badges. So if any of those things sound interesting to you as an instructor, come talk to me and I would love to have that conversation. And that's all I have for my presentation. Since we don't have a ton of people on the Zoom call, I don't know if we have any questions or comments. We do still have some people watching on YouTube. So if anybody wants to chime in on the chat over there, I'm keeping an eye on it on my second computer monitor here. Camille or Ben, any thoughts?
It just makes me think that I might want to think about it a bit more and expand my idea away from a leaderboard idea.
Yeah, well, and like I said, I have seen leaderboards done successfully, usually with a couple caveats. Usually, well, I would always recommend you make it anonymous in some way so that you don't see that Ben is in first place in the class and Caleb is in fifth place in the class. So definitely don't just use student names.
Right.
You might also make it an optional thing where they can opt into or opt out of the leaderboard if they don't really want to do that. Again, some students are very motivated and love getting badges. Some students could care less, but for some of them, it's a surprisingly effective motivator to get some kind of little recognition of their achievement.
I've done some leaderboard stuff and we used nicknames and it was just top 3.
Okay.
So students would know that they're either in the top 3 or they're not, but they wouldn't know how they're doing compared, so they don't get that. If they're new to the subject, they're not completely defeated by that.
That's a good compromise, I think. Because again, if a student is motivated by a leaderboard, even if they're not in the top 3, hopefully it means they're going to try harder to get up there. But then it's not as unmotivating for the students that aren't up there. I like that idea.
Ben, did they know how close they were to the top 3?
Nope.
Okay. Evil.
A little bit. I knew. I mean, and really it was a formative assessment that we used every week. So it was a quick check-in and it allowed me to see where everybody was at, but then kind of made it a little competitive to try to get, for those that wanted to be competitive, try to get to the top. They would get their score, so they'd know how they did, but they wouldn't know how they did amongst their peers unless they were in the top 3 or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to competition, I think like one-off competitions during a class period can be a lot of fun. Many instructors use programs like Kahoot, where you can build a little game show that your students participate on with their cell phones, put them into teams, and there it's got an automatic leaderboard and it's got flashing lights and sounds and stickers and stars. And a lot of students really enjoy games like that, especially for test prep or project review, that kind of thing. And again, there's that level of competition, but it's low stakes. You might not give them any kind of grade other than maybe class participation for just being there. But having that kind of little scoring race can be a lot of fun for a lot of students.
And I've done some of that in in-person classes, but since COVID, I haven't really tried doing anything like that on Zoom.
Yeah, you can. I have seen instructors do a Kahoot through Zoom where they're just sharing their screen. So they're sharing the Kahoot page and all students still have their cell phones. So they still log in, they do their thing. Yeah, I've seen people do it through Zoom. You can also do it offline where you just share the Kahoot link in your Canvas course and then they kind of do it at their own pace. But there's different ways you can integrate it without being in a physical classroom.
When I was listening to your talk, Caleb,
yeah.
I hadn't done a lot of research into gamification prior. It seemed very nebulous, and you did a good job of really categorizing it in a few different ways that I could wrap my brain around. And as you were doing that, I was just thinking, well, that's really, in my brain, I see that as formative assessment. Mm-hmm. I see that as universal design for learning. I see that as authentic assessment. So really, best practices in adult learning and andragogy are also incorporated into this as well. And when you're looking at some of the research, some of the inconclusive research showing not moderate successes, you often wonder how was it implemented? Was it aligned with the outcomes? Was it too much? Was it stickers and princess parties for adult learners, or was it a little more authentic to what an adult would need? Because obviously, like you mentioned, our nursing students go through a lot of simulations and a lot of our programs use these types of authentic assessments that are real life scenarios.
Yep.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. And we're almost out of time here, but it's very hard to measure just because it's just one layer of your entire course design, your entire teaching philosophy. So I have seen really poorly gamified courses where it's a pretty standard, boring course that just has some badges and a leaderboard on top. And it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be motivating. But if the instructor is like you said, using those just good teaching practices of universal design and authentic assessment and student choice and quality student feedback, you're already halfway there. Some of it is just kind of a little bit of chrome on top of the mechanical parts.
Absolutely.
But for some students, they love the chrome, and it is a motivator. And for some instructors, it's exciting to get to plan those things and build them and feel that satisfaction. Well, it is 1:30, and I have another meeting to get ready for. So I think we're probably going to call it a day unless we have any other questions or ideas, Camille.
That's it for me, but thanks a lot.
Yeah, hopefully it was at least kind of interesting, give you some food for thought. And again, I would love to chat with anybody one-on-one who wants to think through some of these ideas and maybe talk about how they might want to implement some of it. All right, well, thanks everybody. I'm going to turn off the YouTube stream, so goodbye to YouTube land. And I'll see y'all later.